Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of betrayal, deception, and a deadly obsession. This is the story of Jessica Langley, a beautiful former pageant queen whose life was cut short in the most horrific way by the man she loved. A tale of jealousy, greed, and calculated violence. This case will leave you wondering, what lengths will someone go to when their perfect life is on the line? And how could someone so close, someone you trust, become capable of such unspeakable acts? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of cut and liquefied by her husband, the dark case of Beauty Queen. Jessica Langley had always been the embodiment of grace and beauty, a woman whose name echoed in the world of beauty pageants and fashion circles. Born in a small, quiet town, she had been something of a local legend even before her rise to fame. From a young age, it was clear that Jessica was destined for something extraordinary. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her charm, poise, and intelligence that set her apart. She captured the hearts of judges in pageants, and by the time she was in her early 20s, Jessica had already earned multiple titles and accolades. Her life seemed perfect on the outside, radiating the kind of glamour most people only dreamed about. But behind the smiles and perfect curls, there was a different story. Jessica's rise to fame had been swift, but it was not without its sacrifices. Like many young women in the competitive world of beauty pageants, she had been pushed to the edge to maintain the image of perfection. The late-night rehearsals, the constant pressure to maintain a flawless appearance, and the unrelenting scrutiny from the media had taken a toll on her. Yet Jessica was resilient. She continued to shine in the spotlight, always presenting herself as the ideal, graceful beauty. The turning point in her life came when she met David Langley. He was a successful businessman, older than her by nearly a decade, but his charisma and charm made him irresistible. Their relationship began as a whirlwind romance, filled with romantic dinners, lavish gifts, and a sense of security that Jessica had longed for. David seemed to be everything she had dreamed of: smart, successful, and ambitious. He came from a wealthy family, and his business empire was growing rapidly, promising even greater things in the future. His outward confidence and polished demeanor matched perfectly with Jessica's image, and together they made an ideal couple: charming, beautiful, and untouchable. Soon Jessica moved into David's luxury estate, a sprawling mansion nestled in an upscale neighborhood. The home was everything she could have ever dreamed of: grand, elegant, and full of exquisite decor. They hosted parties attended by celebrities, socialites, and business elites. It was the kind of lifestyle most people could only fantasize about. Jessica quickly became the centerpiece of David's world. In public, they were always hand in hand, smiling for the cameras, attending high-profile events. Their love seemed perfect, a dream come true for both of them. But beneath this picture-perfect image, cracks began to form. At first, they were small, fleeting arguments, minor disagreements, but over time, they began to deepen. David, once a man who admired Jessica for her independence and ambition, started to exhibit controlling behavior. He became more possessive, more demanding of her time. He constantly questioned her about her activities and the people she interacted with. What once seemed like a protective love slowly morphed into something darker, more suffocating. Jessica, who had always been known for her confidence and self-assurance, began to feel like she was walking on eggshells around David. He was constantly accusing her of being too friendly with other men, suggesting that her beauty would inevitably attract attention. Although Jessica tried to reassure him that there was nothing to worry about, David's jealousy only seemed to grow. Every friendly conversation she had with a colleague, every moment she spent with her friends became a source of tension. David would sulk, withdraw, and then explode in fits of anger over imagined slights. It wasn't just the jealousy that began to wear on Jessica. As David's financial troubles mounted, his demeanor grew more erratic. He had always portrayed himself as a successful, self-sufficient businessman, but behind closed doors, his empire was crumbling. David had made risky investments that weren't paying off, and his lavish lifestyle was becoming unsustainable. Instead of seeking help or being honest with Jessica, he turned inward, allowing his pride to prevent him from admitting the gravity of his situation. The man who had once promised to take care of her now seemed unstable, unpredictable, and increasingly difficult to be around. Despite the tension, Jessica did everything she could to maintain the facade of a perfect marriage. She attended social events, smiling for the cameras, never letting anyone see the strain between her and David. She kept up with her career, hosting charity events and promoting herself as a symbol of beauty and success. But deep down, she began to feel trapped. The world that had once celebrated her beauty now seemed like a gilded cage, with David as the keeper. One of the most striking aspects of their relationship was the growing emotional distance between them. Jessica had always been a passionate, driven woman, but over time she found herself retreating inward, afraid to speak up or voice her concerns. She feared upsetting David, who seemed to become more unpredictable with every passing day. He started to dictate her schedule, telling her which events she could attend, who she could associate with, and when she should be home. His need for control had escalated to the point where Jessica felt like a prisoner in her own life. Yet, Jessica still loved him, or at least she tried to convince herself that she did. She wanted to believe that things would get better, that David was just going through a rough patch, and that their love could overcome the growing tension. But deep down, she began to fear that their relationship was no longer healthy, and the signs of something darker began to appear. As Jessica's world continued to crumble around her, she began to see less and less of the man she had fallen in love with, and more of someone who was consumed by anger, jealousy, and financial desperation. But no matter how much she tried to hold it together, the cracks in their marriage were becoming impossible to ignore. The stage was set. The perfect marriage, once a symbol of beauty and wealth, was now a powder keg ready to explode. And in the shadows of that perfect life, something far darker was waiting to be unleashed. As the months wore on, Jessica's once vibrant and optimistic outlook on life began to fade. The glow that had radiated from her during her beauty queen days was replaced by a quiet exhaustion that seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. She tried to keep up appearances, attending events and fulfilling her commitments, but the cracks in her marriage were no longer something she could ignore. Behind the smile she wore for the cameras, Jessica was slowly being worn down by the relentless pressure of living under David's increasingly erratic behavior. David's jealousy had always been a part of their relationship, but it had reached new, unsettling heights. What had once been occasional bouts of insecurity now morphed into constant, simmering anger. He would call her repeatedly when she was out, interrogating her about who she was with and where she had been. His accusations were often baseless, driven by his growing paranoia, but Jessica learned to keep quiet, to avoid confrontation. The more she tried to reassure him, the more unreasonable his demands became. She started to feel like a prisoner in her own home, living in a constant state of tension. At first, Jessica tried to dismiss his behavior as a phase, hoping that once his business troubles settled, David would return to the loving, attentive husband she had married. But with each passing day, his controlling nature only became more pronounced. David had always been someone who thrived on control, but now it was like a tight grip that suffocated every part of Jessica's life. He scrutinized her every move, from the clothes she wore to the people she interacted with. Every conversation she had with a man was viewed as a potential threat. If she spent too much time away from home, he would accuse her of abandoning him. He would show up uninvited at her work events or social gatherings, his eyes scanning the room, watching her every move. Jessica felt like she was walking on eggshells, constantly trying to anticipate what would set him off. She no longer felt safe in her own home. Her sanctuary, the place where she had once felt loved and protected, had become a house of fear. She had always been independent and fiercely proud, but David's behavior chipped away at her sense of self. She began to second-guess everything she did, unsure of how to please him. In her quieter moments, Jessica couldn't help but wonder how they had gone from being the perfect couple to this fractured, toxic relationship. The emotional toll of this constant scrutiny began to show in more than just Jessica's mood. She started to lose interest in her career, the one thing that had once brought her joy and fulfillment. She began to turn down offers for appearances, public speaking engagements, and charity events. Her once thriving career as a beauty queen and philanthropist had begun to dwindle, and she found herself retreating from the spotlight, no longer the radiant star she had once been. People noticed the change, but Jessica would smile and brush off their concerns, never revealing the true nature of her relationship with David. She wanted to protect him from the judgment of others, even if it meant losing herself in the process. But it wasn't just David's emotional abuse that weighed on her. there were financial pressures building up in the background. While Jessica had always been financially secure, her marriage to David had introduced a new level of wealth, one that was built on appearances and high-profile investments. At first, David's success had seemed like a dream come true. He had bought them a beautiful home, filled it with expensive artwork and furniture, and taken them on lavish vacations around the world. But beneath the surface, David's financial empire was faltering. His business ventures, once highly profitable, had taken a turn for the worse. Risky investments, failed partnerships, and a series of bad decisions had left David in serious debt. Jessica remained blissfully unaware of the true extent of David's financial troubles for some time. She had always trusted him to handle the business side of things, and she had no reason to question his ability to provide for them. But as the cracks in their relationship grew, the financial strain began to seep into their daily lives. David became more distant, more angry. He blamed Jessica for not being more involved in his business, even though she had never been asked to take on any role. He would complain about bills, about the mounting debts, and about the lifestyle they had once enjoyed. The more David's financial situation deteriorated, the more he started to pressure Jessica for money. He demanded that she use her own savings to cover expenses, even though she had always kept her finances separate from his. She hesitated, but David was insistent. He told her that they needed to maintain their image, that their lifestyle couldn't change, and that it was her responsibility to help. His manipulative tactics wore her down, and eventually, Jessica agreed to help him pay off some of the debts. But no matter how much money she contributed, it was never enough. The pressure mounted, and Jessica found herself in the uncomfortable position of propping up David's crumbling empire. Despite all this, Jessica remained loyal to him. She couldn't fathom life without David, the man she had once loved and admired. She refused to believe that their marriage was beyond saving, even though she had begun to feel more and more like an outsider in her own life. The emotional abuse had eroded her confidence, and the financial strain made her feel trapped. She started to doubt her own worth, questioning whether she could ever break free from the suffocating grip of David's control. Jessica's friends and family began to notice the change in her. They could see the toll that David's behavior was taking on her, but Jessica deflected their concerns with a smile, assuring them everything was fine. But deep down, she knew things weren't fine. She could feel the weight of her situation pressing down on her, suffocating her every move. She was no longer the vibrant, confident woman she had once been. The sparkle in her eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet sadness that no one seemed to understand. At this point, Jessica was no longer just struggling with a toxic marriage. She was caught in a web of manipulation, emotional abuse, and financial ruin. And as the walls closed in, the person she had trusted most, the man who had once promised to love and protect her, was becoming a stranger. A darker, more dangerous version of David was emerging, a man whose desperation and obsession with control would ultimately lead to a tragedy that no one saw coming. As the emotional and financial strain of her marriage reached its breaking point, Jessica found herself increasingly isolated. The confident, outgoing woman who had once lit up every room she entered now struggled to muster the energy to even leave the house. David's behavior became more unpredictable with each passing day. His jealousy, once a simmering undercurrent, now consumed him entirely. He no longer simply questioned Jessica's interactions with others, he interrogated her, following her every move with an intensity that left her feeling suffocated. What was once a thriving social life now felt like a distant memory. Jessica withdrew from her friends, stopped attending public events, and even canceled work engagements that she had once eagerly accepted. David's constant demands for her attention meant she was always by his side, and if she wasn't, he would call her incessantly, each message more frantic than the last. If she ignored his calls or even delayed responding, it was met with anger and resentment. Jessica had always been a woman of action, fiercely independent and ambitious, but now she was in a constant state of dread. Every time she stepped outside her front door, she was filled with anxiety, knowing that at any moment David could turn from the charming husband she once adored into a volatile, jealous man. He would show up at her work events unannounced, demanding to know why she was spending time away from him. Her friends, once part of her support system, now avoided her. David's manipulative behavior had driven a wedge between Jessica and anyone who could have helped her. The emotional abuse was becoming more blatant, David would constantly belittle her, calling her selfish or accusing her of being ungrateful for everything he had given her. In private, he would make cruel comments about her appearance, saying that she was aging and that her beauty was fading. These attacks, combined with his increasing demands for control, eroded Jessica's sense of self-worth. She began to question everything she did, wondering whether she was failing him or simply being too distant. In her vulnerable moments, she feared that David might be right, that she was too much of a burden, a flawed woman who couldn't live up to the perfect image he had once seen in her. David's financial troubles continued to spiral. He had tried to hide the extent of his losses from Jessica, but it was becoming impossible. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the extravagant vacations, everything had been funded by mounting debts and risky investments that had failed. The house, once a symbol of their wealth and success, now seemed like a heavy burden. It wasn't long before the bank started sending threatening letters, warning that the property might be repossessed if they didn't pay their overdue debts. David was becoming desperate, but he was also too proud to ask for help. He began to look for ways to maintain their lavish lifestyle, even if it meant taking dangerous risks. Jessica, increasingly withdrawn and isolated, no longer questioned his decisions. She felt powerless and exhausted, unable to stand up to him or take control of her own life. She continued to give him money from her savings, hoping that it would somehow ease the pressure, but it was never enough. David's mood swings became more extreme, alternating between fits of rage and cold, calculating silence. It was clear to Jessica that her husband's obsession with maintaining their image was destroying them. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to confront him directly. She feared what would happen if she challenged him. The once confident and assertive woman was now afraid of the man she had once loved. She felt like she was losing herself, suffocating under the weight of his control and the constant tension that filled their home. David, on the other hand, became more erratic as he realized that his grip on Jessica and on their life was slipping. His jealousy had grown to terrifying extremes. Every man who looked at Jessica, every compliment she received, fueled his insecurity and fear that she might leave him. The thought of losing her, of losing everything he had worked for, was more than he could bear. But instead of working through his issues, David decided to do whatever it took to keep Jessica by his side, even if it meant pushing her to the brink. One night, after an evening event where Jessica had been photographed with an old acquaintance, a man who had once been a fellow contestant in a beauty pageant, David's paranoia reached its peak. His jealousy erupted in a violent outburst. He had followed Jessica home, his face twisted in anger. As soon as they entered the house, he lashed out, accusing her of being unfaithful, of betraying him in the most intimate way. Jessica tried to reason with him, but his rage was uncontrollable. He had spiraled too far into his own delusions. This was the moment when everything changed. David's behavior, which had always been manipulative and controlling, had crossed a line. The man she had once trusted with her life had become a threat. Jessica, in her fear and confusion, backed away, not knowing how to escape this terrifying version of her husband. She had never seen him like this before, and the violence in his eyes made her realize just how far he was willing to go to keep her under his control. The next few days were a blur of fear and tension. Jessica no longer felt safe in her own home. David's anger simmered beneath the surface, but she could no longer tell if it was real or just another product of his jealousy and paranoia. He would hover over her, his eyes never leaving her for long. The house, once a haven, now felt like a prison, and Jessica's once wonderful life had become a nightmare. She realized that she was trapped in a cycle of emotional manipulation, financial ruin, and fear, and there seemed to be no way out. But the most terrifying realization of all was that David, in his twisted obsession with maintaining control over her, was capable of anything. The man who had once promised to protect her had become a monster, and Jessica was slowly coming to terms with the fact that escaping his grip might not be possible. It was at this point that Jessica knew her life was in grave danger. The man she had once loved, the man who had swept her off her feet, was now a stranger to her, a stranger capable of unspeakable things, and the darkness that had been building in their marriage was about to take a deadly turn. As Jessica's sense of fear and helplessness deepened, the distance between her and David grew even more pronounced. The man she had once adored and trusted was now a shadow of his former self, consumed by jealousy, financial ruin, and an insatiable need to control her. The emotional abuse had escalated to the point where Jessica could no longer recognize the man she had married. But despite all the warning signs, she was still too terrified to leave. The thought of walking away from everything, her home, her career, and most of all, David, felt impossible. David's volatile behavior continued to spiral, and Jessica, in her silent suffering, began to question whether there was a way out. But every attempt to distance herself from him was met with threats, manipulation, and further isolation. David's grip on her life was tightening by the day, and with every passing moment, Jessica felt the walls of her world closing in. One particularly haunting night, after another argument that left Jessica in tears, David decided to take things a step further. His cruelty had always been emotional, using words to manipulate and break her down. But that night, something shifted in his demeanor. There was a coldness in his eyes that sent a chill down Jessica's spine. He no longer cared about maintaining their image as the perfect couple or protecting her from the world's judgment. The only thing that mattered was keeping her under his control. David took advantage of Jessica's vulnerability, exploiting her fear and exhaustion. He knew her breaking point. He had been pushing her for so long that Jessica no longer had the energy or will to fight back. His cruel comments, constant accusations, and financial manipulation had worn her down, leaving her with little to hold on to. She was a shell of the woman she had once been, and David had made sure of it. That night, after another round of cruel words and threats, David locked the doors to their house, refusing to let Jessica leave. He began pacing, muttering about how she couldn't escape him, how she would never be free of him. There was no safe space in their home anymore. The fear was suffocating. Jessica had tried to leave before, tried to make an escape when he wasn't looking, but David always found a way to reel her back in. Now, with each passing day, Jessica grew more and more convinced that there was no way out. David's obsession with her was consuming him, and his obsession with maintaining control became a dangerous force. No longer content with just emotional manipulation, he began to threaten physical violence. He would push her to her limits, making her feel as though she had nowhere to turn. The line between love and control had blurred, and Jessica no longer knew what was real. One fateful evening, David's obsession with control reached a horrifying crescendo. After a particularly heated argument in which Jessica expressed her desire to leave, David finally lost control. He snapped. The coldness in his eyes turned to rage as he reached for something in the garage, something Jessica had never thought she would see. He returned with a knife, its sharp edge gleaming under the dim light. His hands shook with anger, but there was a calmness in his eyes that terrified Jessica. He approached her slowly, his words laced with a dangerous calm. He accused her of betraying him, of ruining their lives, of threatening everything they had worked for. His voice, once a source of comfort, now sounded like a distant echo, cold and distant, devoid of any trace of love or care. The knife in his hand was a symbol of the control he had lost over his own life, now turned on her. Jessica was trapped, cornered by the man who had once promised to protect her. The fight for survival that followed was harrowing. Jessica struggled to free herself from his grip, but David's strength was overwhelming. He was no longer the man she had married. He was something else entirely, a monster fueled by rage, jealousy, and a desperate need to break her. His grip tightened, and in the chaos of the moment, Jessica found herself pinned to the ground. The man she had trusted with her life was now the one who threatened to take it. What followed was a blur of pain and terror. David, blinded by his obsession, pushed Jessica further than she had ever been pushed before. Her mind raced, fighting against the overwhelming fear that had consumed her. Every part of her screamed for her to fight back, to find a way to escape. But the emotional and physical exhaustion from months of manipulation had left her weak and vulnerable. She was losing the fight, trapped in the nightmare David had built for her. At this moment, Jessica's survival instinct kicked in. In the split second of clarity amidst the chaos, she reached for the nearest object. She could find a heavy lamp sitting on the side table. She swung it with every ounce of strength she had left, managing to hit David in the face. The impact stunned him, causing him to stagger back in surprise. It was just enough of an opening for Jessica to break free. With one last burst of energy, she ran for the door. But David was quick, far quicker than she had anticipated. Before she could reach the door, he grabbed her again, this time with a vice-like grip around her waist. His breath was heavy and ragged, his voice trembling with rage. "You're not leaving me," he spat. "You'll never leave me." With every part of her screaming for freedom, Jessica knew that she had to fight for her life. As she struggled to break free, David's rage intensified. She could feel him losing control completely. The man she had once loved was now beyond reason, beyond redemption. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she feared for her very survival. David's grip tightened one last time, and in that moment, Jessica knew she had to act fast before it was too late. The final betrayal had been committed. Jessica had become a prisoner in her own home, and now she was fighting for her life. It was a battle she could not afford to lose. The struggle for survival that night would forever alter the course of Jessica's life. As she broke free from David's grasp and raced toward the door, the terror that had gripped her heart reached its peak. David, still reeling from the blow to his face, scrambled after her. His rage was all-consuming now. His desperation to keep her under his control had pushed him past the point of no return. But Jessica didn't stop. Her survival instincts kicked in, and with every ounce of strength left in her, she reached the front door and slammed it behind her, locking it just in time to hear David's enraged shouts from the other side. Outside, Jessica didn't know where to go, what to do. Her mind was a blur of shock, pain, and disbelief. The house that had once felt like home now felt like a tomb, a place filled with memories of love twisted into nightmares. She ran, not looking back, her feet pounding on the cold concrete as she made her way toward the nearest neighbor's house. It wasn't long before the police arrived, responding to a frantic call from a neighbor who had heard the commotion. Jessica, bruised and shaking, barely had the words to explain what had happened. She was taken to safety, but David was already gone by the time the authorities arrived, vanishing into the night like a ghost. A man who had once been her protector was now her greatest threat, and Jessica knew that David wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. The police began a manhunt, but David had always been resourceful. The search would drag on for days, but Jessica was no longer the woman she had been. She was no longer the beauty queen or the successful, confident woman of her past. She was a survivor, battered but determined. The nightmare that had been her marriage had finally ended, at least for now, but the psychological scars would remain. The woman who had once believed in love and trust now understood the darkness that could reside in the heart of someone she had once vowed to spend her life with. Weeks later, the authorities caught up with David, finding him in a rundown motel, hiding from the world. He was arrested, and the charges against him were severe: assault, attempted murder, and a host of other offenses that made his betrayal of Jessica even more chilling. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with Jessica's testimony standing as a testament to the horrors she had endured. But despite the justice that came with his conviction, Jessica's life would never be the same. The trauma she endured in the months leading up to that fateful night would haunt her for years to come. She retreated from the public eye, focusing on rebuilding her life and healing from the devastation David had wrought. Though she never fully recovered from the scars of her marriage, Jessica found a new strength. She worked with domestic violence organizations, sharing her story to help others trapped in similar situations. Her experience, while tragic, became her mission, one that would, in time, help others find their escape from the kind of hell she had survived. The story of Jessica and David became one of the most chilling cases of betrayal, obsession, and violence the community had ever seen. But for Jessica, it was a reminder that, even in the darkest times, survival was possible if you could find the courage to escape. Thank you for joining us on this dark and chilling journey. If you were shocked and moved by the story of Jessica and her fight for survival, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mystery Minds for more true crime stories that reveal the darkness hiding in plain sight. We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. And if you or someone you know is in a dangerous situation, remember, there is always help available. No one should have to suffer in silence. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and keep questioning the mysteries that surround us.